The explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot, sending fragments of metal and paper spiraling through the air in a shower of sparks and smoke. I was halfway through my morning coffee when the blast echoed down Maple Street, followed immediately by the terrified screams of children. My hand instinctively reached for the badge clipped to my belt, 23 years, as a State Fire Marshal had trained me to recognize the distinctive crack of amateur pyrotechnics. And this one was close. Too close. Racing toward the sound, I found 8-year-old Marcus Williams sobbing on his front lawn, his younger sister Keisha clinging to his arm as wisps of acrid smoke curled from the twisted remains of their mailbox. The metal post had been bent nearly in half, and scattered mail smoldered on the sidewalk like confetti from hell. The smell hit me immediately: sulfur, potassium nitrate, and something else. Fear. The kind that clings to your nostrils and makes your chest tight. Marcus looked up at me with eyes wide as saucers, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks. "Mr. David, something blew up our mailbox. We were just getting the newspaper for Mama, and then everything went boom." His voice cracked on the last word, and I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. Someone had deliberately planted an explosive device in these children's mailbox. Someone had wanted to hurt kids. I knelt beside the wreckage, noting the telltale residue patterns that spoke of a homemade device, likely a modified bottle rocket, or M80 based on the blast radius and metal fragmentation. This wasn't some random prank gone wrong. This was calculated intimidation. And, as I photographed the scene with my phone, my professional instincts kicked into high gear. Whoever did this had committed multiple felonies: use of explosive devices in a residential area, reckless endangerment of minors, destruction of federal property, and potentially attempted assault with a dangerous weapon. "Did you see anyone around here this morning?" I asked Marcus gently, but he just shook his head and buried his face against Keisha's shoulder. The little girl, barely 5 years old, stared at me with the kind of shell-shocked expression I'd seen too many times in my career, the look of innocence forced to confront malice. That's when I heard the laughter. It drifted across the street from the direction of the Henderson house, a harsh, satisfied cackle that made my blood run cold. Looking up, I saw her standing on her perfectly manicured front porch, arms crossed over her chest, wearing a pink velour tracksuit that somehow managed to look both expensive and tacky. Karen Henderson, HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards, was watching the chaos with obvious amusement. "Well, I suppose that's what happens when people don't properly maintain their mailboxes," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the morning stillness. "Maybe now they'll learn to keep their property looking respectable, instead of letting it drag down everyone's home values." I stood slowly, pieces clicking into place with the mechanical precision of a firearm being loaded. The Williams family had been fighting Karen and the HOA for months over alleged mailbox violations. Their perfectly functional black metal mailbox apparently didn't meet her vision of neighborhood uniformity. She'd been pressuring them to replace it with an expensive cedar post model that matched the other houses on the block, threatening fines and legal action when they couldn't afford the upgrade. As I approached her property line, Karen's satisfied smirk widened. She clearly thought this was some kind of vindication, proof that the Williams family deserved whatever misfortune had befallen them. Her bleached blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes, and her orange spray tan gave her the appearance of an overripe fruit left too long in the sun. "Terrible shame about their mailbox," she continued, not bothering to lower her voice despite the fact that the children were still within earshot. "But honestly, David, you have to admit, they brought this on themselves. I've been telling the HOA board for weeks that their non-compliance issues would eventually catch up with them. Some people just need to learn the hard way." The casual cruelty in her tone made my hands ball into fists. Here were two terrified children who'd just experienced what amounted to a terrorist attack, and she was treating it like cosmic justice for failing to meet her aesthetic standards. But something else in her manner caught my attention, the way she kept glancing toward the blast site. The barely contained excitement in her posture. She wasn't just pleased about this incident. She was proud of it. "Karen," I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "Do you know anything about what happened here this morning?" Her laugh was like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, David, you're always so serious. It was just a little wake-up call. Nothing more. I figured they needed something dramatic to get their attention, since all my official notices weren't working." She waved her hand dismissively, as if we were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than an explosive device that could have killed or maimed children. The admission hung in the air between us like a live wire, crackling with implications. My training took over, and I felt myself shift into what my colleagues called investigation mode, the mental state where every word became evidence, every gesture a potential confession. Karen seemed oblivious to the gravity of what she'd just revealed, too caught up in her own sense of righteous vindication to realize she'd essentially confessed to multiple felonies. "A wake-up call," I repeated, pulling out my phone and discreetly activating the voice recorder. "What exactly do you mean by that, Karen?" She preened like a peacock, clearly delighted to have an audience for her cleverness. "Well, you know how they are, David. Some people just don't respond to proper authority unless you speak their language. I thought a little firecracker in their mailbox might help them understand how serious I am about maintaining neighborhood standards." She paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer with a conspiratorial whisper. "It was supposed to be harmless, just loud enough to scare them good. Get their attention, you know." The pieces of my mental puzzle snapped together with crystalline clarity. Karen Henderson had just confessed to deliberately placing an explosive device in a mailbox, with the express purpose of intimidating a family that happened to be one of only 3 black households in our predominantly white subdivision. This wasn't just criminal mischief, or even simple harassment. This was a hate crime wrapped in the veneer of HOA enforcement. By now, other neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. I could see Mrs. Patterson from 2 doors down, comforting the Williams children while their mother, Denise, hurried home from her early morning shift at the hospital. The growing crowd seemed to embolden Karen further, and she raised her voice as if addressing an audience. "You all know I've been trying to work with them reasonably," she announced, gesturing grandly toward the Williams house. "But some people just refuse to follow the rules that the rest of us respect. Their mailbox has been a neighborhood eyesore for months, bringing down all our property values. I gave them plenty of warnings, sent multiple certified letters, even offered to help them find affordable alternatives." Her voice took on a martyred tone, as if she were the victim in this scenario. What she didn't mention, what she conveniently omitted from her self-righteous narrative, was that the Williams family had been struggling financially ever since Mr. Williams lost his job at the auto plant 6 months ago. Denise had picked up extra shifts as a trauma nurse to keep the family afloat, and their 16-year-old son Jerome had taken a part-time job at the grocery store to help with expenses. Spending $300 on a new mailbox wasn't just difficult for them, it was impossible. I watched Karen's performance with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a particularly toxic specimen. She seemed genuinely convinced that she was the reasonable party here, that her actions were justified by some perverted sense of community standards. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. She could look at 2 traumatized children and see only vindication for her own prejudices. "So you placed an explosive device in their mailbox," I said quietly, making sure my phone was capturing every word. "With the intention of frightening children." Karen's laugh was sharp and brittle. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. David, it was just a little bottle rocket. Nothing that would actually hurt anyone. I'm not some kind of monster. I just wanted to make a point about consequences." She paused, tilting her head with mock concern. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised it made such a mess. I guess their cheap mailbox wasn't as sturdy as it should have been. Another example of how they cut corners. Really." The sheer audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. Not only had she deliberately terrorized children with an explosive device, but she was now blaming them for the extent of the damage. It was victim blaming taken to such an extreme that it bordered on sociopathic. Around us, the crowd of neighbors had grown larger, and I could see shock and disgust written across their faces as they absorbed what Karen was saying. Mrs. Patterson had gone pale, one hand pressed to her chest, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Tom Rodriguez from the corner house was shaking his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and revulsion. But Karen, lost in her own twisted sense of righteousness, seemed oblivious to the changing mood around her. If anything, the attention seemed to energize her further, and she continued her impromptu speech with growing enthusiasm. "You know, David, as HOA president, I have a responsibility to maintain certain standards in this neighborhood. We all signed contracts when we moved here, agreements to uphold the aesthetic and property values that make Maple Gardens such a desirable place to live." She gestured sweepingly at the well-maintained houses around us, their matching mailboxes and manicured lawns, creating the kind of suburban uniformity that she clearly found deeply satisfying. "And when certain residents repeatedly ignore those standards," she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "well, sometimes more creative enforcement methods become necessary. I've been far too patient with them. Honestly, any other HOA president would have started finding them weeks ago." The casual way she discussed terrorizing children as a creative enforcement method sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just prejudice, or even simple cruelty. This was the mindset of someone who had completely dehumanized her targets, reducing them to obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be respected. I was about to respond when Denise Williams came running up the street, still wearing her hospital scrubs, her face etched with panic and exhaustion. She took one look at the destroyed mailbox and immediately gathered her children into her arms, her professional composure cracking as she absorbed the reality of what had happened. "My babies," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My poor babies. Were you hurt? Did anyone get hurt?" Marcus and Keisha clung to their mother, their earlier shock giving way to fresh tears as they felt her fear and distress. Watching this reunion, seeing the raw terror and love in a mother's eyes as she realized how close she'd come to losing her children, something cold and implacable settled in my chest. This wasn't just about property values or HOA regulations anymore. This was about a family that had been deliberately targeted and terrorized because they didn't fit someone else's vision of acceptable neighbors. Karen, incredibly, seemed to view Denise's arrival as an opportunity to continue her lecture. She straightened her tracksuit and put on what she probably thought was a diplomatic expression, then approached the grieving family with the confidence of someone who believed she held the moral high ground. "Denise, I'm glad you're here," she said, her tone suggesting she was doing the other woman a favor by acknowledging her existence. "I think this unfortunate incident has made it clear that we can't continue to ignore the mailbox situation. I'm prepared to be reasonable about payment plans, but the replacement really needs to happen soon." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the morning birds seemed to stop singing as everyone processed the monumentally tone-deaf nature of Karen's statement. Here was a woman who had just admitted to terrorizing children with an explosive device. And her primary concern was still extracting compliance with her mailbox requirements. Denise Williams looked up from her children with an expression I'd seen before, the look of someone who had reached the absolute limit of what they could endure. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but carried the kind of steel that comes from years of fighting for your family's dignity. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that you put a bomb in my mailbox because you didn't like how it looked?" Karen's face flushed red at the word bomb, and she waved her hands dismissively. "Now, that's hardly fair. Denise, it wasn't a bomb. It was barely even a firecracker. And it's not about what I like or don't like. It's about the standards we all agreed to maintain when we moved into this community. Your mailbox is explicitly prohibited by our HOA guidelines. And I've been more than patient in trying to work with you on a solution." The conversation had taken on a surreal quality, like watching someone dig their own grave while insisting they were planting flowers. Every word that came out of Karen's mouth was another nail in her legal coffin. Another piece of evidence that would be invaluable when this case went to court. And it would go to court. I was going to make absolutely certain of that. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Karen Henderson, I'm placing you under arrest for the use of explosive devices in a residential area, reckless endangerment of minors, destruction of federal property, and attempted assault with a dangerous weapon." The effect was immediate and electric. Karen's mouth fell open in shock, and the color drained from her spray-tanned face so quickly that she looked like a deflating balloon. Around us, the assembled neighbors gasped and murmured, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "You can't arrest me," Karen sputtered, backing away from me with sudden panic in her eyes. "You're not even a real police officer. You're just our neighbor, David. This is ridiculous." I reached for my badge and held it up where everyone could see it clearly. The morning sunlight caught the gold-plated surface, making the state seal gleam with official authority. "I'm State Fire Marshal David Chen. Ma'am, I have full law enforcement powers in matters involving explosives, arson, and fire safety violations. What you just described to me constitutes multiple felonies under state and federal law." The transformation in Karen's demeanor was instantaneous and dramatic. The confident, self-righteous HOA president vanished, replaced by a cornered animal looking desperately for an escape route. Her eyes darted around the crowd as if seeking allies, but found only neighbors staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to disbelief. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "I mean, you never said you were. I thought you worked in insurance or something corporate. This is just a big misunderstanding." I pulled out my handcuffs, the metallic click as I opened them seeming to echo in the morning stillness. "Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney." But Karen wasn't done digging herself deeper. As I approached with the handcuffs, she continued to protest, her voice becoming increasingly shrill and desperate. "This is insane. I'm the HOA president. I was just trying to maintain community standards. All I did was put a tiny little firecracker in their mailbox to get their attention. It's not like I was trying to hurt anyone." Each word was another gift to the prosecution. I made sure my phone was still recording as I guided her hands behind her back and secured the cuffs. The cold metal seemed to finally drive home the reality of her situation, and she began to sob, not with remorse for what she'd done to the Williams family, but with self-pity for the consequences she was facing. "You don't understand," she wailed, looking around desperately at the neighbors who had once deferred to her authority. "They're bringing down our property values. Their mailbox doesn't match the neighborhood standards. I was just trying to protect everyone's investments." Tom Rodriguez stepped forward from the crowd, his face grim with disgust. "Karen, you terrorized children with a bomb. Nothing else matters after that." "Mrs." Patterson nodded emphatically, still holding Keisha Williams's hand. "I've been wondering why the Williams family seems so stressed lately. Now I know it's because you've been harassing them for months over something as trivial as a mailbox." The mood of the crowd had shifted completely. What had started as a typical suburban morning had become a community reckoning, and Karen found herself isolated and exposed in ways she clearly hadn't anticipated. The neighbors who had once tolerated or even supported her authoritarian approach to HOA leadership were seeing her true nature for the first time. As I guided Karen toward my unmarked car to wait for the backup units I'd called, she made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "David, please, be reasonable. We're neighbors. We go to the same community meetings. Surely we can work this out without involving lawyers and courts and all that unpleasantness." I looked back at Marcus and Keisha Williams, still clinging to their mother, their young faces marked by trauma they should never have had to experience. Then I looked at the smoking ruins of their mailbox, the scattered fragments of what had been a deliberate act of intimidation and terror. "Ma'am," I said quietly, "when you decided to use explosives against children, you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. This isn't about being neighbors anymore. This is about justice." The backup units arrived within minutes, 2 squad cars, and a crime scene investigation team I'd specifically requested. As the uniformed officers took custody of Karen and began processing her for transport to the county jail, I returned to the Williams family to begin the formal evidence collection process. Denise Williams watched the arrest with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. "I can't believe she actually admitted to doing it," she said, shaking her head. "All these months, I thought I was going crazy. The threatening letters, the harassment, the constant complaints about every little thing we did. I started to wonder if maybe we really were the problem." I knelt down beside Marcus and Keisha, offering them what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "You were never the problem," I told them firmly. "What happened to you was wrong, and the person who did it is going to face the consequences. That's what justice means, making sure that people who hurt others have to answer for their actions." As the crime scene team photographed and collected evidence from the blast site, I took detailed statements from the Williams family and several of the neighbors who had witnessed Karen's confession. The case was building itself between her recorded admissions, the physical evidence, and multiple witness statements. This would be one of the most straightforward prosecutions of my career. But even as I focused on the technical aspects of the investigation, I couldn't shake the deeper implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about one woman's descent into criminal behavior. This was about the toxic intersection of racial prejudice, petty authority, and community power structures that had enabled someone like Karen to terrorize a family for months without serious consequences. Jerome Williams, the family's 16-year-old son, arrived home from his morning shift at the grocery store just as the last squad car was pulling away. He took one look at the destroyed mailbox and the remaining crime scene tape, then rushed to his family with obvious panic. "What happened? Is everyone okay? Why are there police cars?" His voice cracked with the same fear I'd heard from his younger siblings. But underneath it was something else, a weary resignation that no teenager should possess. This young man had clearly learned to expect trouble, to anticipate that his family would be targeted simply for existing in a space where others didn't want them. Denise Williams gathered her eldest son into the family embrace, her professional composure finally cracking completely as she realized how close she'd come to losing one or all of her children. "She put a bomb in our mailbox. Jerome, Mrs. Henderson put a bomb in our mailbox because she didn't like how it looked. The aftermath stretched through the morning and into the afternoon. As word of the incident spread through the neighborhood, more families came forward with their own stories of Karen's harassment and intimidation tactics. The Nguyens from Oak Street revealed that she'd threatened to have their decorative Buddha statue removed as inappropriate religious imagery. The Hernandez family shared emails where she'd complained about their children speaking Spanish too loudly while playing in their own backyard. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple HOA enforcement. Karen Henderson had been systematically targeting families who didn't fit her narrow vision of acceptable neighbors, using her position as HOA president to wage a campaign of psychological warfare against anyone she deemed undesirable. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, pulled me aside as I was finishing my initial report. "David, I need to tell you something that might be important. Karen wasn't always like this. When she first moved here 5 years ago, she seemed normal, even friendly. But after the HOA elections 2 years ago, when she became president, it was like a switch flipped." She paused, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "I think the power went to her head. She started seeing herself as some kind of neighborhood guardian, responsible for keeping out what she called undesirable elements. At first, it was just passive-aggressive comments and overly strict interpretations of the HOA rules. But lately, it's been getting worse. Much worse." This context was crucial for understanding how a suburban housewife had escalated to using explosive devices against children. It wasn't a sudden break from reality. It was the logical endpoint of a gradual descent into authoritarianism and racial prejudice, enabled by a community structure that had given her unchecked power over her neighbors' lives. As I completed my evidence collection and prepared to head back to the state office to file my reports, Denise Williams approached me one final time. Her earlier fear had been replaced by a steely determination that reminded me why she'd chosen a career in trauma medicine. This was someone who faced crisis head-on and fought for every life under her care. "Marshal Chen," she said formally, "I want to make sure this goes all the way. Not just the criminal charges, but everything. I want our community to understand that what happened here today was about more than mailboxes and HOA rules. This was about a family being terrorized because of the color of our skin. And I want that acknowledged in whatever legal proceedings follow." I nodded, understanding the full weight of her request. "Mrs. Williams, I can promise you that every relevant charge will be filed and pursued to the fullest extent of the law. What Karen Henderson did today wasn't just criminal mischief, it was domestic terrorism. And it will be prosecuted as such." The next several weeks unfolded with the methodical precision of the justice system at its best. Karen Henderson was formally charged with multiple felonies, including the use of explosive devices in a residential area, reckless endangerment of minors, destruction of federal property, terroristic threatening, and civil rights violations. The federal charges came courtesy of the FBI's Hate Crimes Division, who took a keen interest in the case after reviewing my reports and the recorded confessions. The HOA held an emergency meeting 3 days after the arrest, and the vote to remove Karen from her position was unanimous. In her place, they elected Maria Hernandez, a school counselor whose first act was to suspend all pending enforcement actions pending a complete review of the organization's policies and procedures. But the real transformation happened in the community itself. The shock of discovering that their HOA president had been terrorizing neighbors with explosive devices forced a long overdue conversation about the culture of exclusion and intimidation that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Tom Rodriguez organized a neighborhood barbecue specifically to welcome the Williams family and other residents who had been targeted by Karen's harassment campaign. Mrs. Patterson started a fund to help families who had been financially pressured by discriminatory HOA enforcement. The Nguyens invited neighbors to learn about their cultural traditions, while the Hernandez family began offering free Spanish lessons for anyone interested in becoming a more inclusive community. I attended that barbecue, not as a law enforcement officer, but as a neighbor who had witnessed something ugly being transformed into something beautiful. Watching Marcus and Keisha Williams play happily with children from families of every background represented in our subdivision, I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond any successful prosecution. The legal proceedings took several months to work their way through the courts, but the outcome was never in doubt. Karen Henderson pled guilty to all charges rather than face the additional evidence that continued to emerge during the investigation. The prosecution had recovered her internet search history, which included multiple queries about harmless ways to scare neighbors and small explosives that won't hurt anyone. They'd also found a cache of additional fireworks in her garage, suggesting that the Williams family might not have been her only target. At the sentencing hearing, I sat in the gallery, watching as Karen Henderson faced the consequences of her actions for the first time. She had aged considerably during the months since her arrest, her carefully maintained appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who had finally been forced to confront the reality of what she'd become. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Morrison, delivered a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the need for community healing. Karen was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the Williams family for their destroyed mailbox and the cost of trauma counseling for the children, as well as a substantial fine to the state's Victim Compensation Fund. But, perhaps most importantly, Judge Morrison included a provision in the sentence that banned Karen from any involvement in homeowners associations or similar community organizations for the duration of her probation. The message was clear. Positions of authority in communities are privileges to be earned through service and respect, not weapons to be wielded against those who are different. During the victim impact portion of the hearing, Denise Williams spoke with the same calm professionalism she brought to her work in the trauma ward, but her words carried the weight of a mother's love and determination. "Your Honor," she said, looking directly at Karen as she spoke, "what happened to my family that morning wasn't just about property values or neighborhood standards. It was about someone who decided that we didn't belong in the community we'd chosen to call home, and who was willing to terrorize children to make that point. My daughter still wakes up from nightmares about loud noises. My son flinches every time he walks past our mailbox. That's the real damage that was done here, not to property, but to the sense of safety and belonging that every family deserves." She paused, gathering herself, then continued with even greater intensity. "But I also want to say that what happened afterward gives me hope. Our neighbors didn't just condemn what was done to us. They took action to make sure it couldn't happen to anyone else. They showed us that the true character of a community isn't defined by its worst members, but by how the rest of the community responds when those worst instincts are exposed." When Karen was given the opportunity to address the court, she offered what sounded like a rehearsed apology that focused more on her own suffering than on the harm she'd caused. She spoke about losing her friends, her position in the community, and her sense of purpose, but showed little genuine understanding of why her actions had been so fundamentally wrong. It was a disappointing but not entirely surprising response. True accountability requires a level of self-reflection and empathy that Karen had never demonstrated, and prison time alone wouldn't magically instill those qualities. But the legal consequences served their purpose, protecting the community from someone who had proven herself capable of escalating violence, and sending a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. As I left the courthouse that day, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. It had started with my routine morning coffee being interrupted by an explosion, and it had ended with a community transformed by its decision to choose justice over comfort, inclusion over exclusion. The new mailbox that the Williams family eventually installed was actually quite beautiful, a custom cedar post design that Jerome had built himself in his high school woodworking class, with decorative metalwork created by his sister as part of her art project. It bore a small plaque that read, "Williams Family, established 2019, marking not just their address, but their permanent claim to their place in the community. But the real memorial to what had happened wasn't in wood or metal. It was in the relationships that had been forged in the aftermath of crisis, the conversations that had been started about inclusion and belonging, and the quiet revolution that had transformed a subdivision from a collection of houses into a genuine neighborhood. Sometimes justice comes in dramatic courtroom moments, but more often it arrives in the smaller, everyday choices that communities make about who belongs and how differences should be celebrated rather than eliminated. The explosion that had shattered the morning silence on Maple Street had also shattered the illusion that hate could masquerade as community standards. That intimidation could be disguised as enforcement. 6 months after Karen Henderson began serving her prison sentence, I was once again walking down Maple Street with my morning coffee when I heard the sound of children laughing. Marcus and Keisha Williams were playing in their front yard with the Rodriguez twins and the Nguyen children, their joyful voices carrying clearly through the morning air. The sound was as beautiful as the explosion had been terrible, and it reminded me why the work of justice, difficult and sometimes painful as it can be, is always worth the effort. The mailbox stood straight and proud at the end of their driveway, no longer a symbol of harassment or exclusion, but a simple marker of home. And home, I had learned, is not something that can be defined by the color of a mailbox or the conformity of a landscape. Home is what happens when a community decides that everyone deserves to belong, and when neighbors choose to protect rather than persecute those who are different. That explosion had been meant to drive the Williams family away, to make them feel unwelcome and unsafe in the place they had chosen to build their lives. Instead, it had driven away the hate that had been poisoning the community, leaving room for something better to grow in its place. That's the thing about justice when it's done right. It doesn't just punish wrongdoing. It creates space for healing, for growth, and for the kind of community we all deserve to call home. As I finished my walk and headed home to begin another day as a State Fire Marshal, I carried with me the knowledge that sometimes the most important cases are the ones that happen right in your own neighborhood. Sometimes, justice isn't about investigating distant crimes or anonymous perpetrators. Sometimes, it's about having the courage to hold accountable those closest to you, those who share your zip code and your community meetings. When they choose hate over humanity. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the perfectly imperfect landscape of Maple Street, where mailboxes, in various styles and colors, stood as individual expressions of the families they represented. And in that diversity, in that beautiful refusal to conform to someone else's narrow vision of acceptability, I saw the true meaning of community, not uniformity, but unity in difference, not exclusion, but the radical inclusion that makes a neighborhood into a home for everyone who chooses to belong.